So thank you very much for having me today at the conference. It's really an honor to be here. Today I'll be talking about business dynamism and innovation. And I'm looking forward to your questions. So I've been working on this topic for quite some time. And for various countries, I've been investigating with various co-authors. I've been investigating the business dynamism in various countries. We recently also started to investigate this issue in Germany. Since it's still preliminary, I won't be able to say much today, but I will be sharing some of my results from other projects. And so in general, my research focuses on economic growth. And as Stefan very kindly mentioned, I'm trying to look into the micro data. As a macroeconomist, of course, I want to come up with macro predictions and macro policy recommendations. But my research question always, and my research approach always starts from the micro data. So that's why I'm going to share some very interesting findings from micro data. And I'll try to tell you a little bit about why we should care about business dynamism and decline in business dynamism. So before I start, maybe I should start with a slightly broader question. So why should we care about innovation? And the reason I'm saying innovation is because at the end of the day, we care about economic growth in the long run. And in the long run, economic growth is driven by innovation and technological progress. So ultimately, we want firms to invest in R&D. We want inventors to sit down to think about new technologies and new ideas and introduce them to improve our productivity, which later on leads to economic growth, of course. So ultimately, it's about innovation. And if there's a decline in business dynamism, as I'm going to highlight later in my talk, business dynamism influences innovation, and when innovation goes down, economic growth goes down. So that's why ultimately we care about business dynamism, because it leads to innovation, and innovation leads to economic growth. So first, let me ask this important question. Why do we care about innovation? The theory tells us that the innovation leads to economic growth, but the empirical evidence on this is quite limited, mostly because it is very hard to find long-run data on innovation. Of course, we have long-run data on GDP or demographics, but when it comes to innovation, it's really hard to measure it in the long run. So as part of our research agenda, what we did with Tom Nicholas from Harvard Business School is that we digitized all the patent records in the United States since 1836. And this became a proxy for innovation in our research. And then we asked various interesting questions. So the first question that we asked was, how does innovation relate to economic growth in the long run? And here in this figure, I'm showing you 100 years of patenting and 100 years of economic growth in all states in the United States. And as you can see, there's a very strong correlation between innovation proxied by patenting and economic growth. Of course, I should highlight at this point that patents doesn't capture all the innovations, but it's a nice proxy. It's a good proxy that we can measure in the data in a systematic way. If in a region there's a lot of innovative activity, then you can also see a lot of patent coming from that region. And the advantage of patent records is that you can link patent records to firms, you can link patent records to individuals. So that way you can ask various interesting questions. So for instance, what are the characteristics of the firms that are producing patents or that are producing more influential patents? And so, you know, in my research, I've seen, for instance, firms that are run by younger CEOs are more innovative on average. And so, for instance, firms that are more open to disruptive ideas, they are more innovative on average. So that's the advantage of using patent data. And on the inventor side, in my research, I've seen that children that are born to rich families are more likely to become inventors, and people that are more educated are more likely to become inventors. So from this type of analysis, you could easily come up with policy recommendations like, for instance, in unequal societies, giving equal access to children for education is an important innovation policy, for instance. Anyways, leaving those things aside, what I wanted to say is that the first takeaway is that in the long run, we see a strong link between innovation and economic growth, also empirically. Of course, economic growth is just capturing one average number from year to year. So we measure the GDP per capita from one year to the next, and then we look at the growth rate. Well, we might not simply care only about the average growth in the average GDP per capita. We might also care about how things are being distributed in the society. And in this second graph, I'm showing you the link between innovation and social mobility. Social mobility is defined as conditional on being born to a poor family or conditional on being born to a low-skilled family. What's the likelihood that the child is going to be high-skilled or high-income earner? And here we see a very strong relationship between innovation and social mobility. So this means that this dynamism this is true because it creates dynamism in the society through creative destruction. So for instance, if you allow a child's creativity, even if they are born to a poor family, if they are able to express their creativity, then they are going to introduce the next big business idea or the next big innovation or next big technology. And this turnover in the society is leading to social mobility and also economic growth. But I should also mention that innovation is related to social mobility if innovations are coming from new entrants. So that's why keeping up business dynamism, and that's why keeping up dynamism, innovative dynamism in general, is extremely important. That's why we have to keep an eye on whether entrants are able to come in and replace incumbents, and whether we can create creative destruction or not is becoming an important policy question. The reason I'm emphasizing this is because I think in many countries, especially in the US or in Italy, this type of creative destruction is slowing down dramatically. Especially incumbents are becoming stronger and stronger, and having a stronger incumbent prevents new entrants from coming in and replacing them in the market. And that's why business dynamism or innovative dynamism is declining over time. And hopefully by the end of my talk, I will be able to convince you of that. So far, I told you two things about innovation. First, innovation is related to economic growth. Second, innovation is related to social mobility. You might say, well, why do we care about income only? We should care about the well-being of individuals. Indeed, we see a very strong relationship between innovation and well-being as well. A couple of years ago, I've done some research with the Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton, Philippe Aghion, and Alexandre Roulet, and we related the innovation to subjective well-being of individuals. Of course, you can proxy innovation in many different ways. One of them is patenting, as I mentioned. The second one is, since it's related to creative destruction, it also creates turnover, job turnover. So here, I'm proxying innovation with the job turnover rate in the society. On the x-axis, we have the job turnover rate. On the y-axis, we have the well-being of individuals. And we see a positive relationship between the two. But again, there's a twist to this argument. There's a nuance to this argument, and we have to be really careful before we make any strong conclusion. Turnover in the society relates to well-being, but there are two mechanisms through which turnover relates to well-being. One of them is that it's typically caused by innovation and creative destruction. That's why the income of individuals are rising over time. When income of individuals are rising over time, of course, everybody is happier because the consumption goes up. And so as a result, people are becoming happier. But when there is innovation and job turnover, this by definition also creates winners and losers. So when a new entrant comes in and replaces an incumbent, of course, the new entrant opens up a new firm, and creates employment, and as a result starts creating job, and it's great to work for that firm. But on the flip side, there's a loser in this process, right? The previous incumbent is going out of business, and the people or the workers who used to work for this incumbent company joins the unemployment pool. All these people who are joining the unemployment pool are becoming unhappy out of this. So as a result, so it creates winners and losers. That's why we have to take both of these aspects into account. When there's innovation and creative destruction, there's economic growth, but there's also job displacements that's taking place in the society. When we tease out these two effects in our empirical analysis, we see that innovation has a massive impact on subjective well-being through its impact on positive impact on subjective well-being through its impact on this capitalization effect or economic growth effect, but it has a strong negative effect on well-being through job displacements. So that's why when we think about designing policies, we have to think about also the losers in the society or in this process, and in order to make this growth process more inclusive, we have to also potentially think about retraining programs so that people who are losing their jobs can also find jobs easier and can participate in this economic growth process. Now, so far, I mentioned that innovation is good for the society for three reasons: because it causes economic growth, it causes social mobility in the society. Sorry, it's a bit late in the day and I'm being slow. And the third good news here is that innovation leads to happiness and more well-being. But the problem is, over time, we see decline in innovative capacity, and we see a decline in dynamism in many countries, especially in the US and various European countries. And why does it happen? Why do we see a decline in business dynamism? People have proposed many alternative scenarios. Some people said that, oh, you know, the population is getting older over time. That's part of the reason why we see less dynamism. Some people argued that, well, the interest rates are declining. When the interest rates are declining, this creates some decline in dynamism. Some people have argued that unions have become weaker over time, worker unions, and through some channels, this decline in worker power might also lead to decline in dynamism. So people have proposed many different stories. That's why it is really important to understand why we see a decline in dynamism. Depending on the answer, we are going to come up with a different policy recommendation, right? So this is like, you have a headache, you go to a doctor, you look for a medication, but you cannot just simply imitate the medication that somebody else is taking, because the reason for your headache could be different than somebody else's headache. And it's exactly the same story for countries. We cannot just look at one country and then just say, oh, you know, in this country, we observe these type of trends, so that's why the decline in dynamism in other countries should be for the same reason. That's not really the case, right? We need to have a framework, and we need to use the microdata in each country in order to understand what's happening exactly. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the US in the beginning, then I will talk about the Italian economy. But as I mentioned, now we are also doing some interesting work for Germany. And what we are seeing for Germany is quite different than what we see in the case of US. So that's why every country has its own story. And so that's why I think it is important to study the microdata in each country separately. So what I'm going to do now is the following. So people have argued that new entry is important for business dynamism. So that's why some researchers have focused on decline in entry rate, for instance, in the US. Or some people argued that the labor share in the US is declining, and globally also labor share is declining. Some people try to explain the decline in labor share. But what I'm going to argue is that all these facts that we observe in the data, decline in entry rate, decline in labor share, or decline in average growth of the firms. All these things could be related. And if we really want to get to the bottom of this issue, we need to also rely on economic theory. So just looking at the data is not sufficient. We need to create a dialogue between theory and data so that we can come up with the convincing conclusion about what's happening, so that we can also come up with the right policy recommendations. So that's why what I'm going to do today is that first I'm going to put together all these facts, and then I'm going to propose a theory, and then I'm going to create a dialogue between theory and data by estimating this model. And then I'm going to do a horse race between alternative hypotheses. For instance, the decline in union power, or the decline in interest rate, or if the ideas are getting harder over time to find, etc. There are all these competing hypotheses, and I will try to do a horse race among them in order to see which of these mechanisms comes out to be stronger. Okay, so that's going to be the roadmap for today. So today's work will be building on two of my recent work with Sina Atesh. One of them is forthcoming in American Economic Journal Macroeconomics, and that's about the title of that paper was 10 Facts on Declining Business Dynamism. And this second paper that we are currently revising for Journal of Political Economy is asking what happened to the US business dynamism. So I'm going to draw conclusions from both of these projects. So let me summarize the facts that we observe in the data. Fact number one, market concentration in the United States have been increasing over time. What is market concentration? Market concentration is the market share of the largest 4 firms or largest 20 firms, depending on how you measure it. You see that the largest firms in each market are gaining a bigger and bigger share over time. So the market concentration is increasing. Second, average markups are increasing. What is average markup? Average markup is the price relative to marginal cost. And when you look at the average markup is increasing. The firms are charging a bigger and a higher and higher price relative to their cost since 1980. So we are talking about 40-year period, and over the past 40 years, the average markups have been increasing. Third, when the average markups are increasing, of course, it's not necessarily 1-for-1, but there's a strong relationship between profits and markups. When we look at the fraction of GDP that's being paid out as profits in the national income account, indeed, the profit share of GDP had been increasing. So it used to be around 6%. Now it's up to 14% in the US. So over the past 40 years, the profit share of GDP have been increasing dramatically. Next, labor share has been decreasing. So labor share was around 2/3 in the data around 1980. Now it went below 60%. So combining the two, the business owners are now earning bigger and bigger share of the pie. The workers who are working for production is getting a smaller and smaller share of the pie over time. Another interesting, I think you don't see the top of my slide, so that's why I'm going to just exit from the full screen and try to make it full screen again. Okay, now you should be able to see the top of my slides more easily, hopefully. So we see a negative correlation between market concentration and labor share. So the two facts that I showed you earlier indeed relates to each other also at the micro level. So I showed you that the market concentration is increasing and the labor share is decreasing. But this was at the macro level, at the economy level. When we look at the sector level, we see that the relationship between market concentration and labor share is negative also at the market level. In markets where the largest firms are dominating the market more and more, they also end up paying less and less to their workers. The next fact is an interesting one. So this fact tells us that the labor productivity gap between market leaders and the followers are opening up. Okay, so when we introduce new technologies, of course, the firms that are producing are becoming more and more productive over time. But in order to make the entire economy more productive, we need to make sure that technologies are diffusing, or the knowledge is diffusing in the economy. And if labor productivity goes up only for one firm, this doesn't mean that the productivity will be going up for the entire economy. As long as this technological progress is contained only within one firm, that's not enough. We need to make sure that the new technologies that we are introducing is also diffusing in the economy. We need these technologies to be diffused in the economy. But what we see in the data, unfortunately, is that the market leaders' productivity is increasing, rising over time, but the followers who are supposed to challenge the market leaders are not able to keep up with the market leaders. So as a result, when you look at the productivity gap between market leaders and followers, it's opening up over time. Okay, so normally we should be able to see a parallel lines here. Unfortunately, that's not the case. The leaders are doing relatively okay, but the followers are falling behind over time. Next, so far we talked about the incumbents. Let's talk about entrants. When we look at entry rate in the United States, entry rate has been declining. Entry rate is the number of new entrants relative to incumbents. The number of so the entry rate is defined as the number of new entrants relative to the number of incumbents. When we look at that ratio has been declining over time. It used to be around 14%, now it's below 8%. Less and less entry over time. And of course, when you have less new entrants, young firms' economic activity is also declining. So here I'm showing you the employment share of young firms. Young firms are defined as less than 5-year-old. And the employment share of young firms used to be around 18%. Now it's down to 8%. A massive decline in the employment share of among young firms. So young firms are participating less and less. This is very important because, you know, Joseph Schumpeter was arguing that this turnover in the society, the creative destruction, is an important driver of economic growth. And what we see here is that the entrants are participating less and less in economic activity. So economic activity is shifting more and more to incumbents. More so, it's shifting more to market leaders. And it's the markets are being dominated by large market leaders, and the followers are participating less, or they are able to challenge the market leaders less over time. And when there's less creative destruction, there is also less job reallocation. So job reallocation here is defined as job creation and job destruction rate, the sum of job creation and job destruction rate. Normally, in a healthy economy, what we want to see is that productive new entrants should grow over time, and unproductive incumbents should exit the economy, and all these workers that used to work for unproductive incumbents should get reallocated to more productive incumbents or more productive entrants. And this type of job reallocation is responsible for 50 to 75% of the overall productivity growth. When we do growth decomposition, this is the number that we see in the data. And we see that job reallocation has been declining over time. And this is also something that we should be aware of. And finally, this is also an important fact. When we look at the growth rate dispersion of the firms, that's been shrinking over time. So what do I mean by this? This is a non-trivial fact, and I want to go a bit slow over this one. So take two economies. One of them is a very boring economy. It's not dynamic at all. It's a very static economy. Firms are not investing in any new technology. They are not investing in R&D. When you look at the growth rate of the firms in an economy like this, all the firms will be growing at the rate of 0. When you plot the growth rate distribution of all the firms, there will be a spike at zero because no firm is growing, no firm is shrinking. It's a boring economy. Nobody's investing in new technologies. All the firms will be sitting at the growth rate of zero. Now, let's make this economy more dynamic. All the firms are investing in new technologies. Some of them are succeeding, some of them are failing. So as a result, some firms will be growing very fast. And on the flip side, some firms will be shrinking. And as a result, when we look at the growth rate dispersion in this economy, there will be a wide growth rate dispersion here. Why? Because firms are trying and some of them are succeeding and some of them will be failing. So as a result, the growth rate distribution will have a nice dispersion. So how dispersed this growth rate distribution is telling us how dynamic this economy is, how much experimentation there is in this economy. So what we see in this graph is that the dispersion is shrinking, which means that there is less and less experimentation among firms. So overall, this is the summary of what we are seeing in the data. First, market concentration is increasing. Second, average markups are rising. Third, profits are rising. Fourth, labor share is declining. Fifth, market concentration and labor share are negatively correlated. Six, labor productivity gap between frontier and laggard firms have been increasing over time. Seven, entry rate has been declining. So it's not only the incumbents are getting lazy, it's also entrants are entering less over time. 8, when there's less entry, the share of young firms' economic activity is declining over time. 9, when there's less entry, there's also less job reallocation from incumbents to entrants. And 10, the dispersion of firm growth rate has been decreasing over time. So all these things are happening over the past 40 years in the US economy. But what do these facts tell us? In order to understand what these facts are, in order to understand the message that's coming from these 10 facts, I'm going to propose now a theory that will help us understand what's happening. And that way I will be able to also do a horse race among competing hypotheses here. So the model, of course, I'm not going to show you Greek letters here and equations and etc. I'm just going to give you the intuition of the model. So the intuition of the model will be the following. These facts are hinting at the fact that there is a decline in competition. So as a result, I'm going to introduce a model that takes the competition among firms very seriously. And the key thing here will be that there will be a strategic competition among competing firms. Okay, there will be a strategic competition among competing firms, meaning that two firms in every industry will try to capture the market leadership. And the reason the firms will try to innovate will be to improve their markups. Firms will be charging markups for the products that they are producing. And if I innovate, I will be able to escape from my rival, and I will be able to charge higher markups. Think of the following example. So it's just like two athletes racing to finish a race. If I'm neck and neck with my rival, I will try really hard in order to win this race. But if my competitor is very close to the finish line, and if I'm really far behind, then I'm not going to try hard because I lost my hope of winning because my rival is almost finishing the race. So as a result, I will just say, why should I bother pushing hard? So that will be the intuition here. If the two firms are neck and neck, then the firms will try really hard in order to introduce the next big technology, because that way I can capture the market leadership. But if my rival is already very advanced, and if I'm really far behind, then I will get discouraged and I will lose the hope of winning the market leadership. I think that's what's happening in many markets. Think about a new graduate from business school, for instance. Think about a student who is graduating from Chicago Booth or Harvard Business School, etc. Now that student is asking the following question: should I build a new company or and challenge Google with my new company, or should I try to get a high paying managerial position in Google or Facebook? Obviously, the latter is much better option, because currently, if I try to build a new startup and try to challenge the large incumbents, probably I will run into some trouble. Why? Because typically these large firms are having a big patent arsenals, and they are typically threatening these young new entrepreneurs. And this is what we call the killer acquisition, and that's taking place quite frequently in the US economy, and also in Europe. Indeed, in one of the conferences, I was talking to the head of the competition agency of France, and he was also mentioning a similar story for the French economy too. So this killer acquisition is what's happening in the US and in Europe too. And I think this is discouraging new entrepreneurs from entering and challenging the incumbents. So that's why I think this is something that we have to be careful about. So here's the intuition of the model. So I want you to think of the economy as a continuum of sectors, and here I'm telling you, I'm giving you an example of 5 different sectors. In sector 1, there are 2 firms that are neck and neck. In sector 2, so these red dots are indicating the market leaders, and the blue squares are indicating the followers. So here in sector 1, the firms are neck and neck. So it's a very competitive sector. In sector 3, the market leader and the follower has some gap, but the gap is small. Whereas sector 5, the market leader is very far ahead of the market follower. So the gap is really, really big. Now, in this economy, the market leaders, the red squares, are trying to innovate because, so the height of these bars are indicating the level of their technology. The market leaders are trying to innovate because the gap between leader and follower is determining the markup that they can charge. So, for instance, look at sector 1. When they have the same technology, of course, through charging, so they will be competing over prices. So since they have the same technology, nobody has a price advantage over their rival. So as a result, the price competition will drive down profits to 0. But in sector 5, the red circle, the leader, has a big advantage over its follower. So as a result, the leader has the luxury of charging a high markup, because the follower's technology is much worse than the leader. So as a result, this gives the leader the advantage or the luxury of charging a higher markup. So this gap between market leaders and followers will give some room for market leaders to charge higher markup. So that's the incentive for leaders to innovate in this model. If the leader innovates, then they are going to improve their markups. Of course, the followers are trying to innovate in order to catch up with the leader and in order to capture the market leadership. But if the gap is big, the follower has to come up with a lot of innovations. And this, of course, discourages the innovation if the gap is big, because this will require a lot of innovations to catch up with the market leader. So as a result, the follower will not push hard in a market like this market 5. But in sector 1, since the firms are neck and neck, both firms have a very big incentive to innovate, because even a small innovation will give an advantage, because that way they will start charging some markup. So at the same time, entrants are trying to come in and challenge the market leaders in this model. But if the market leader is really advanced, then it will be very hard for the new entrant to come in and take down the market leader. Okay, so this is going to be the structure in this model. And finally, we also allow for a mechanism here, which is the knowledge diffusion. So in this economy, the leader is trying to innovate in order to improve the markups. The follower is investing in R&D in order to catch up with the market leader. But in every economy, there is knowledge diffusion. okay, the followers are also learning from market leader, even if they don't invest in R&D. This is just like researchers, right? So we talk to each other, we learn from each other, and uh, also among firms, there are local spillovers, technology spillovers. Firms by when engineers are hanging out together, or when you look at the product that your rival is producing, you also learn from that new technology that they are introducing, and you try to reverse engineer and you try to learn from those technologies. So there are knowledge diffusion, there are knowledge spillovers in the economy, and I'm going to capture that knowledge diffusion in the economy by delta. Then what we do in this economy, in this model, is that we take this theoretical framework and estimate this model to the US economy, and then we do various counterfactual policy exercises. So for instance, what we do is we try to do a horse race among competing hypotheses. For instance, we say, what would happen if there are tax cuts in the United States since 1980? Because when we look at the data, we see that the effective corporate tax rates have been declining in the US since 1980. Or there have been massive R&D benefits that's been introduced to market leaders in the United States. We will take the model and we will introduce some R&D benefits to market leaders. And we will also lower the knowledge diffusion in the economy, because this has been also an argument that the knowledge diffusion might have come down in the United States. So we do a horse race among alternative hypotheses. For instance, we also introduce a decline in interest rate in the model. We also introduce ideas being harder, or we also introduce a weakening of worker power. And then we try to see which of these mechanisms that people have argued in the literature can explain all these 10 facts that I introduced in the beginning. Indeed, the only mechanism that can explain all these 10 facts simultaneously is the decline in knowledge diffusion. All other mechanisms that people have argued, for instance, lower corporate taxes in the US, or higher R&D subsidies, or higher entry costs, or decline in interest rate, or ideas getting harder, or weaker worker power, none of these mechanisms can explain all these 10 facts simultaneously. The only mechanism that can explain all these 10 facts simultaneously is the decline in knowledge diffusion, okay? So then the question becomes, why is knowledge diffusion declining in the United States? So far, what I tried to do is the following. First, I listed the empirical facts that we observe in the microdata, and I put 10 facts on the table. Second step, I build a model, and this model allowed me to replicate the US economy. And when I have this US economy in an estimated model, I could do a horse race among competing mechanisms. And I used these 7 mechanisms in my model. I introduced these 7 mechanisms into my model in order to see which of those mechanisms can speak to these 10 facts. And the only mechanism that could speak to those 10 facts was the decline in knowledge diffusion. And the question becomes, why is there less knowledge diffusion from market leaders to market followers in the US economy? Now I will go back to the microdata, and I want to show you a number of interesting trends. So let me, in the interest of time, I'm just going to touch upon a subset of these facts. One fact that we observe in the data is that the patenting share, the largest 1% of the firms are producing more than 50% of the patents in the US today. So this share used to be 35%. Today, more than 50% of the patents are being produced by the largest 1% of the firms. So a massive increase in the patenting concentration. When we look at the secondary market for patents, the picture is even worse. So when we look at the secondary market for patents, less than 30% of the patents were being bought by the largest 1%. Today, that share went up to 55%. So in the secondary market, the largest firms are becoming more and more active. And this relates very much to the killer acquisition story that I told you. So normally it would have been great if these technologies were being bought for productive reasons. But what we see is that most of these patents are being bought by the largest firms, and they are just being put on the shelf, or they are being put on sleep, because the reason these patents are being bought to kill the competition. So let me show you one more very interesting graph that we recently produced using the census data with Nathan Goldschlag from the Census Bureau. When we look at the share of inventors hired by young firms, inventors are working less and less for young firms over time. So early in the year 2000, around 15% of the inventors used to work for young firms. Today, when we look at the inventors, less than 8% of the inventors are working for young firms. So inventors are being hired more and more by incumbents. Is this good news or is this bad news? Of course, it depends on what these inventors do when they work for incumbents. So for this, we did an interesting exercise, and this is, I think, very important in order to understand whether the picture is a rosy picture or whether this is an alarming picture. So here I'm showing you two event studies, and the event is the following. When an inventor gets hired by a large incumbent, as opposed to a young entrant, when an inventor is hired by a large mature incumbent, what happens to this inventor's salary, and what kind of projects is this inventor working on? Okay, one of them is indicating the private return, the other one is indicating the social return. The private return is the salary that this inventor is earning, and the social return is the quality of the project that this inventor is working. If this inventor is working in better projects, once he or she starts working for a large mature incumbent, then this is good for the society. But if this inventor is working for worse projects, then this is bad for the society. So the left picture here is showing us the quality of the projects. First, the number of projects, and we also did the same exercise with the quality of the projects. And what we see is the following. Time zero is the time when the inventor is being hired by a mature incumbent. This is prior to being hired, and this is after being hired. What we see here is that, very interestingly, in a very worrying way, once the inventor is being hired by a mature incumbent, the innovation of this inventor is starting to decline. So the inventor becomes less and less productive once this inventor is being hired by a mature incumbent. Well, you might say maybe this inventor is getting less productive, and in return, he's or she's being paid less. The answer is no. The right figure here is showing you the private compensation of this inventor. When this inventor gets hired by a mature incumbent, the salary, the paycheck jumps up dramatically. The earnings go up, but productivity of the inventor goes down. And this is, as I said, is worrying. This shows a negative picture overall for the society. And this suggests that there is some strategic game that's being played. Because, of course, when you hire a key, for instance, let's say with Stefan, we are competing. Okay, Stefan is running a firm, I'm running a firm. and Stefan is running a competing firm, and he has some key inventors in his company. When I hire his star inventors into my company, of course, his company starts to slow down because he loses his key engineers and inventors. When I hire these inventors from his company, am I putting these inventors into a good use? The answer is no, because the left picture is showing that once I transfer these people to my company, they are becoming less and less productive and less innovative. So the dynamism, the overall dynamism is declining. But of course, since this is creating some private benefit for my company because I'm killing competition in this market, there is some surplus, and I share the surplus with the inventor by paying them a higher salary. So these two pictures are suggesting that there's some strategic game that's being played among competing incumbents in the economy. So that's why I think it's a worrying story. So overall, in the micro data, we see quite a bit of quite a few interesting results that suggest why there might be less and less knowledge diffusion in the economy. First, let me just summarize them. Higher share of patents are being produced by the largest 1%. So this means that the largest firms are building a patent wall or patent fence around themselves. So there is some patent thicket that's being built by market leaders, and that prevents knowledge from being used by the rest of the firms in the society, because by relying on these IPs, by relying on the wall that I'm building around myself, I'm trying to prevent competition, and I'm trying to prevent my rivals from using the knowledge that's being produced in the society. Second, in the secondary market for patents, firms are getting more and more active. Largest firms are getting more and more active. Third, patent concentration and the share of litigated patents are positively associated with market concentration, profits, and markups. So we see in the data, and this is a new report, this is some work that I've done with some researchers at the IMF. Hopefully we will start circulating it soon. And what we see is that patent concentration and the share of litigated patents are correlated strongly with declining business dynamism that are also proxied by market concentration and rise in markups. When we look at the inventors in the data, we see that the lower share of inventors are working for young startups, and this again is bad for dynamism. Another fact that we observe in the data is that a decline in patents produced and citations received by inventors after starting a job in mature firms. As I mentioned, inventors, when they start in mature firms, they work on less creative projects. But when they work for mature firms, there's a rise in earnings of the inventors. Another thing that we see in the data is that startups that are being founded by inventors are producing more employment. They are creating more jobs. But we also see a decline in startups that are being founded by inventors. So inventors are not creating jobs anymore. Inventors are not forming companies anymore. Inventors are working for mature firms. That's also coming from a recent work that I've done with Nathan Goldschlag. And then another fact that I mentioned, unfortunately I had to skip that, is that higher M&A activity is negatively associated with business dynamism. This is also coming from a work that I've done with the IMF researchers. Hopefully we will start circulating that work soon. So overall, unfortunately, when we look at the data, we see a decline in dynamism, and this is very much related to some strategic game that's being played by market leaders. And this is also true in Italy. Indeed, I want to conclude with this very interesting figure. So the data shows us that the market leaders are becoming stronger and stronger, and this discourages competition, and this discourages new entry. So as a result, the policy makers should be focusing more and more on what type of policies can spur competition or can encourage more competition. Usually, many policies that we think are good for the economy might not be good for the economy. For instance, if you think about R&D tax credit, for instance, typically that's being put into place because we want to encourage more R&D and innovation. But what happens in the end is that these R&D tax credits are very hard to utilize, and typically firms need an army of lawyers in order to benefit from those policies. And guess who is benefiting from them? Of course, it's the large incumbents who have access to these army of lawyers, and typically large incumbents are benefiting from this. Or, you know, when we introduce tax cuts, it's typically, again, it's the large incumbents that are benefiting from this. So we have to also think about the secondary market for technologies. For instance, licensing, encouraging more licensing could be a way of encouraging more knowledge diffusion in the economy. So at the end of the day, we need to keep an eye on the pro-competitive policies. So I'm running out of time, but let me just conclude with this very interesting picture that shows that indeed incumbents also in Italy are playing some strategic game. So what we did in the case of Italy is the following. We try to understand how much market leaders are utilizing the political system. And for this, we looked at the rate at which firms are hiring ex-politicians. So we did an interesting work by merging social security data with the registry of local politicians. And being a local politician is a part-time job. So as a result, politicians can also work for some companies in Italy at the same time. And as a result, we simply looked at the firms and the rate at which they are hiring local politicians. Here on the x-axis, I'm showing you the market leadership. Number 1 indicates that the firm is market leader. Number 2 is the second largest firms. This is the 5th largest, and 20 is the 20th largest firm in any market in Italy. And on the vertical axis, I'm going to show you the number of politicians that these firms are hiring relative to their size. And this shows you that as firms are becoming the dominant market leader, they end up hiring more and more politicians. What about their innovativeness? Well, their innovativeness is declining. This is the number of patents that they are producing relative to their size. As firms are becoming the dominant market leader, their innovativeness is declining. When you put the two together, you see that the market leaders are relying more and more on the political system, and their innovativeness is declining. So that's why I think when we are talking about business dynamism, we have to keep an eye on, you know, these type of strategic interactions that's taking place. So now I'm out of time. Let me just thank you for now and open the floor for questions.